Hello everybody and welcome back to the workshop for part 5 of AQUACERAS. So we're going to be today working on the feet as promised, because last week we made this, which is the base plate, but this needs to have the feet that slot into these spots on the back. So I think we should just jump straight in. What are we going to be doing? Well, we're going to be starting off by making the frame. So the feet are going to be constructed from two parts. There's going to be a part which is turned on the lathe from some thick aluminium bar, and then there's going to be like a leg section. So before we can tackle the turned part, we need to make the leg. So how are we going to be doing that? Well, as with the other parts, we've got some hefty 10mm aluminium. So again, this is 6082 T6 aluminium, and we're going to be putting this onto the CNC and cutting out the legs, but it's a little bit trickier than you might first envision. What makes these parts kind of tricky is that they're actually fairly small. So if we take a look at the base, I was very easily able to put M6 threads into here because it's quite big. There's a lot of space that I can clamp nice and evenly without getting in the way of the tool. However, these actually are quite spindly. The parts themselves are large enough, but I won't have space to put an M4 thread or an M6 thread without interfering with the tool path. So how am I going to get around this? Well, I'm going to make a fixture plate. But instead of doing it separately, I'm going to mill it at the same time as doing the main operation. So on one side, I'm going to do the parts 1 to 4. And then on the other side, I'm going to do the fixture, and it's going to use exactly the same coordinates, so it should all be nice and consistent, and I never have to remove it from the machine for this process. So the cool thing about that is not only will I be able to do the finishing on that part to make it nice and smooth, but I'll also then be able to use it later on because I want to do this finishing step with these as well. So I'm going to be using the glass blasting setup. I'm going to get them nice and matte, and then I'm going to put them back on the fixture plate so that I can do some lovely bright chamfers around the outside, and I think that should be really good. To put the parts back on the fixture plate, I'm going to be using some really handy little bits of hardware. Now, if you're a CNC machinist by trade, you will likely have seen these plenty of times before. These are Mighty Byte fixture clamps. So I've got some really tiny M4 ones that are very low profile, and I'm going to be using them for quite a few projects in the future, and I think this is a perfect instance on where I can use them. So these basically going to go on the inside of the little pockets that I will have milled out, and they will be milled out to final dimension in the first op. Now I'm going to take those and then I'm going to use them on the fixture plate, which will be nicely referenced, and it should be very accurate and just slide on, and then these will clamp around the outside. Now this should be nice and strong because actually that rim is about 8mm thick, and I very much doubt it's going to move and flex. And additionally, I've got the little brass head ones here, so they shouldn't even mar the finish. If they do mar it, it's going to be on the inside, so you won't be able to see it, so it should keep extra finishing steps to a minimum. Now, if you're not accustomed to how these work, it's actually a very simple mechanism. Basically, these M4 threads have a cap on the top which is off center, so it acts a bit like a whole cam, which then takes the head here and then pushes it into the part. Now the trick is you have to use the correct level of torque. So these use 2 Newton meters. So I've got my torque wrenches, I'm going to be doing that properly, and because I'm threading into the aluminium, I should be able to get perfect thread engagement while using the thread milling option. So I'm thinking it should do pretty well. With that all said and done, the cam itself is fairly straightforward. I'm using pretty much all the same recipes that I've used for the previous parts. Now what was tricky though was the order of operations, because I've got to make sure that I maintain rigidity throughout the entire op. And I also wanted it to be easy to relocate back on the bed in case I need to take it off and put something else on, for instance. So to that effect, what I'm going to be doing is machining around the outside to get a nice reference point, and that's going to be finished up at the end using a 4mm end mill. And I'm going to be machining the inside of the pockets first using tabs originally, so it saves me having to do a deep pocket. I will then pull those out and then do a finishing maneuver using the 4mm cutter, and that will leave a really good finish. Now I'm using a 4mm rather than a 5 or 6mm because these internal radii are a little bit close. So to avoid the end mill having a huge amount of contact during the cutting, I'm going to use a smaller one, and that should keep it nice and even and help with the finishes and keep them nice and accurate. Now accuracy is important because I need it to have a very close fit on the fixture side of things. So these pins have a tiny offset on the inside of it, so it should just about slot on. Now, what I will do is I'll double check everything to make sure that that's correct and use cutter compensation in case anything is slightly off, and then it should fit just about, because the tighter the fit there, the less of an issue it is going to be for the clamping. Now, what I'm then going to do is finish off the outside when they're clamped on there, and I'm also going to face the top and the bottom and then flip it around so that I can do both sides. And then after that, we need to do some manual work, so I need to put some holes on the ends and do some threading, because the feet are going to thread in from the bottom. And then we also need to do some work on the belt sander to get it nice and round profile. And to do that, I'm going to be 3D printing some extra little jigs and things which I can use to help me with that process, because that's a manual process, but not everything has to be manual. And then after that, we're going to go to the lathe and do the work on the round feet, which will also have the same sort of finish. So it's going to be really exciting, really challenging, and I'm very much looking forward to how it's going to come out. So let's get the material on the machine, and then we can start steps 1 for op 1 and see where it goes from there. So we've now finished the preliminary machining for these legs here. So what we need to now do is the hand finishing. So I need to put a radius on the end here, as well as adding the mounting holes on this side and then another one on this side. Now to do that, overnight I printed off a bunch of little guides. So I mentioned I'd be making some jigs. So here's the first one. This kind of Frankenstein's monster looking thing is basically a little clamp. So the way it works is I have a tip on the end here, so one of these. Now the cool thing about these is that these are replaceable. So I've made the body basically be the single unit, and then that, which is going to get scuffed up and used when I'm doing the filing or using the belt sander and getting hot, that can just be replaced very easily, and I can print loads of these off in a few minutes. This takes quite a while to print, especially with a hefty bit of infill, so I thought it just made sense to do that, and it uses some little screws that go on the underside and then connects it like so. Now the way this works is I've got these two M6 screws that go into the side here, and I've got two plastic washers. Now these washers basically prevent the screws from marring the surface too heavily on the part. Because whilst I will be going at them with the bead blaster, obviously bead blasting is quite a light abrasive process and it won't remove heavy marks left by screws. So what I do is I carefully slot it in like so. Align it with the curve on the inside, which matches the inside profile of the leg, and then I just tighten it a little bit. And now that's held fairly firmly in place and should mean that I can get quite a repeatable radius quite easily. Now, whilst I'm obviously going to be doing that by hand and it's going to be a bit tricky, having a guide is going to make things a lot easier, I think. Now, that's not the only part that I've 3D printed as well. So I've got this thing here, which is basically like a parallel. Because obviously I'm going to be drilling on this side here. Well, this part here is going to be a little bit of an issue, because if you put that on a flat surface like so, it's yeah, it rocks a bit. So this is basically just something to line up. It slots in, and then I can put that into my vise. Now, speaking of a vise, now this is quite funny actually. So the vise that I've been using for my drill press all along is crap. Like, look at this thing, right? This is... If you always wonder why I buy quite expensive tools, it's because if you don't, you get crap like this. I mean, I don't know what use this is, but I've had this for years and I've only ever been able to use it pretty much as dead weight. I mean, look at that. It wobbles around, it's got nothing. I mean, look, you can put something on one end. Say we've got something like one of these Allen wrenches. We can tighten it up. Look at that. Look how skew that jaw is. That's completely useless. So that's a pile of crap. So I got a better one, and this arrived yesterday. Oh. Look at that bad boy. So I picked this one up on Axminster and it arrived the other day. It is so much better, and this is still quite a budget product, but it just works properly. I mean, it's got nice smooth ways, there's no wiggle at all, no play whatsoever, which does mean you can clamp things off center without worry. And you can also use the parallels this time, because on the previous one, the plates were sort of turned into like a V shape like that, and anything in the parallels was no longer parallel. This, however, will keep things nice and parallel, which means that drilling things like this surface on the inside here, so I need to drill a hole here for the feet, that's going to be very easy, because I can just use the parallels. Now obviously we need to make the feet themselves, and I'm going to be doing that on the lathe. So I've got a load of aluminium stock. In fact, I've got way too much aluminium stock, but this is what I'm going to be using, and this is about 43mm outer diameter. I'm going to be turning that down to roughly 40mm. It doesn't actually matter, but I'm just going to take sort of the scale that I think looks right, and then we're going to have to work out how to do this, because this is actually kind of tricky because they're quite short and there's a long taper on them. I'll part them off. Hopefully I can do that on the machine, because I've never tried parting something this large, and parting on a mini lathe is very, very difficult. I'm going to take them and then I'm going to maybe make a like a separate op, which I can then do the facing on the other side, use an M6 counterbore. Now in terms of finishing, that's an interesting one as well. So I'm thinking perhaps I should finish them on the lathe first, and then instead of doing them afterwards, I should mask them and then do the beading. Because if I do the glass beading after masking, it should leave the outside nice and crisp still, but get that lovely glass bead finish along the top of the taper. So that's one way. I guess when we get there, we'll see exactly what's the best way to give it a go. But for now, I think we should get on with some of the handwork and then potentially getting the lathe ready and see where we go from there. Well, of course I went and completely underestimated how tricky making these was going to be. In fact, I would go so far as to say that these feet have been the trickiest parts that I have ever made to date, because there are just so many things to think about. So they kind of look simple, and that's the whole goal, but actually the number of steps involved in getting there, and they're not always very obvious as well. I had to sort of figure them all out on the fly, because there wasn't one best way to do things. So starting off with the actual little round feet themselves, those are really difficult because my lathe sucks, okay? It's a little mini lathe and it lacks basically rigidity, consistency, concentricity, basically every single thing you want in a lathe, and it has a complete lack of torque as well. So it means I have to take very tiny cuts. I don't have a powered crossfeed, so I have to do everything manually, which means getting a even finish across the face of something is really difficult. And I had to just completely give up on parting. I gave it a go. I even made a brand new parting tool. Look here. I made this out of HSS steel, heat treated it, did every single thing. No, it's not good enough. I don't have enough torque to use one of those. Even when I do it in reverse to try and get more rigidity, no, absolutely useless on 40mm stock. It works fine on 20mm and below, but 40mm, no chance, not with aluminium at least, and definitely not with brass. So I gave up and used the miter saw for that, which was tricky because what you didn't see is it botched one of the parts because it wobbled a little bit and caught it just as it was finishing. So I had to make a brand new one late at night. So that wasn't exactly great. Then on top of that, I had to figure out how I would be able to hold everything without marring the finishes. And that's pretty difficult as well, because actually this is pretty soft stuff. So if you put some screws or heavy duty clamps on it, the finish gets completely destroyed. So I had to figure out a way for that, and that's where the fixture plate came in. So the fixture plate was really interesting because I've never used those Mighty Byte clamps before, and they do seem to work fantastically. Now the fact that they've got little brass heads on them, I think really did help because they basically didn't mar the finish on the inside. So I'm hoping to use those quite a lot in the future because I think that'll be rather convenient. Problem is though, I couldn't use them on these because the ones designed for round heads basically have little teeth in them. Well, that's no good. And also I wanted to machine the edges. So luckily I remembered that I could just put some M6 screws, which happen to be the same size that I'm using here, into the bed, and that's how I went around. But then I managed to lose my work coordinates, and that's because I paused the machine during a bore operation. And unfortunately, with my machine, if you pause apparently in a bore operation, it causes it to go absolutely mental, and it goes like whizzing around. My gantry went out of square, so I had to spend all of last night fixing that. And bear in mind, this happened at about 9:30 p.m. That's a really bad time. I didn't finish until about midnight, and that's on Thursday, okay? Today, filming is a Friday. We're meant to be releasing this video today, so, you know, quite last minute here. So I was definitely panicking, and it did actually bite into one of the parts. So I had to redo all of them just a little bit smaller to kind of make up for that little bit there. But they're not very noticeable. They were supposed to be 40mm, now they're 38. I think we'll survive. That said, the glass blasting finish is absolutely fantastic, and I especially love it with these chamfers. It just adds that lovely contrast, and also the lovely kind of smooth edge around the outside of these parts. Now I did mention that I wanted to do that on the lathe. Yeah, I canned that idea because the more I started using the lathe, the more I realized, well, certainly with the tooling at least that I've got, there's no hope of me getting this sort of edge on the lathe using the powered crossfeed. It would have bands all along it. Now maybe if I had a sharper tool, I might be able to do that. So maybe I could have made one out of this, but this takes quite a long time and I don't have a grinding wheel, so I can't just easily repurpose something. So instead I thought I'd just take it to the CNC, I can use the tools that I know work, and that seemed like the sensible approach. I know it's not quite as exciting as doing it on the lathe, but sometimes you've just got to take the option that works. Now, this is a crucial part, and the next one is going to be the rear panel. So this is the front, this is the rear, and we need to do the rear I/O and the motherboard tray, and that's going to be a big one. So that's going to be the next part for this vlog. Now, the best way to keep up to date, of course, is to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we're going to be posting all the updates over here, and also you can find us over on Discord. I'm always putting little tidbits here and there and having a great chat over on our server, so that's linked below. You can also find us over on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and builds.gg. And also, whilst you're here, don't forget to check out the merchandise store if you'd like to support the channel and get some sweet BitTip merch at the same time. We're going to be adding to it over time, so make sure you check back regularly. Take care, folks, and I'll catch you next time.